I will now take questions.
How is it possible that no one saw both Michael and David in person for 7 months, from March to October? Do you think if anyone would have gone to the house just once, that his life maybe would have been saved?
We believe that there were multiple opportunities, and that's part of why the safety net failed, that had anyone seen the boys in person, given the state of their starvation at the time that the EMTs arrived to take them to the hospital, that it would have been very evident that they were being starved to death. But I have to tell you that in this case, the father and his girlfriend staged the virtual visits, which only occurred in a bad cell phone view, staged those in a way and answered for the children. And so there was not a clear view of the state of both David and Michael.
Maria, do you know why DCF didn't classify them as high risk given the long history they had with child welfare agencies, given that, I mean, at high risk they would have done in-person visits? Why weren't they classified as that?
I think that that is one of the major errors in this case, that despite the directions that DCF issued to its staff when it became clear that there was sufficient PPE and that all of us understood what was safe and not safe in terms of going out in the community, that the boys' disability and the family's very challenging history were not taken into account, and this was clearly a major error in this case.
Maria, you said that the parents are the only two people who are responsible here, but yet there have been so many failures and missteps, as you have pointed out in this report. How come more people aren't being charged with failure to act in this case?
The job of the Office of the Child Advocate is to only examine the systematic failures in this case. I think it is fair to say that it is only the father and his girlfriend who took intentional acts to prevent the boys from being seen. There were many errors of judgment that occurred by staff both at the Department of Children and Families and staff at the Fall River Public Schools. But none of those actions were intentional. All of those individuals continued to try to reach out to the family. What we can say is that clearly, as we document in the report, that there were missed warning signals by staff at the Department of Children and Families. And that was a serious error, but that the staff at the Department of Children and Families did continue to the best of their ability to reach out to the family to make the required visits, even though we all now acknowledge that this is a family that should have been identified for in-person visitation.
What grounds did DCF cite for reunification? What was their rationale for reunifying, and also how was it possible that one triplet chose not to pull back?
The issue of why the Department of Children and Families made two decisions. The first decision was to change the goal from adoption back to reunification, and therefore that set in motion the decision to reunify the children back home. This was an issue for which the employees and managers who made those decisions were never able to provide a justification for why that happened. And in the series of meetings that occurred where those decisions were made, there is no documentation in the record of the discussion of those meetings and the rationale for why those decisions were made. And DCF has confirmed that there is nothing in the record. And one of our recommendations in this case, clearly coming out of this tragedy, is that those clinical decisions need to be well documented and articulated in every single case, especially around decisions for reunification or goal changes.
So just to pick up on that, do you know why one of the triplets didn't want to go back?
What I can share with you is that Noah, and these are all Noah's name and Aiden's name, as you will recall in our report, are pseudonyms because their names have not been publicly identified. Noah had, in the record, traditionally reacted badly when he was in the presence of Jackie Coleman. And that there was a failed, as we document in the report, a failed first attempt overnight visit. When he was returned in the middle of the night to his residential school, he indicated he would not go back, and DCF honored that request. So Noah continued throughout the period when his two brothers were reunited with John and Jackie. Noah continued to reside at his residential school.
Can I ask how communicative these boys living with autism were? Were they able to, if DCF had attempted, would they have been able to tell their caseworkers what the situation was?
Yes. David was higher functioning than Michael, but given the descriptions of their level of functioning, despite their autism spectrum diagnosis, that the individuals both at their residential school and that their teachers at the educational collaborative both indicated that those two boys would have been able to communicate had they been allowed to communicate.
I'm amazed that nobody from DCF tried to talk to the boys. I mean, they seem old enough if they were high functioning and able to communicate that they were able, no one tried to talk to them without the parents present. I understand the limitations of the pandemic.
There were questions asked by the assigned social worker in this case. Jackie Coleman answered for them and prompted them to answer.
Maria, do you have a sense, and I realize it's hard to maybe separate out the mistakes from the pandemic, but if there wasn't a pandemic and the safety net sort of didn't falter the way it did, do you believe that these warning signs would have been caught, or was this sort of just goes back to the failure of the agency?
I believe that if we had not been in lockdown mode and those boys were able to go to school and to be seen in person by the Department of Children and Family social worker, that the stress that caused their behavior to regress would have been quickly identified, and I do believe that appropriate action would have been taken by the Department of Children and Families. Now, I want to be clear that in our analysis of this case, that does not excuse the poor decision-making that happened in terms of the change of that goal from adoption back to reunification, nor the decision to return all three triplets, although only two went home, to a family that was not capable of safely taking care of them.
How did they get away with not doing any schoolwork or even remote learning? Did the parents act like they were them doing the schoolwork, or?
I think it's fair to say that in that initial period, and so we all need to go back to what it felt like last March. For those of us who've been on the front lines on a day-to-day basis, we were getting more information from the CDC and quickly adjusting what we thought was the appropriate course of action. The Fall River Public Schools actually put together a very careful attempt to reach out to the family. They offered Chromebooks, they offered to send packages home, they continued to communicate with DCF their concerns that the family was unreachable. But I think it was fair to say that the concerns around the pandemic, which the family exploited, every time someone tried to see the children, every time someone asked for an outside visit, there was some excuse about some member of the family being ill or having been exposed to COVID, and that it is, although it's unfortunate, it is certainly understandable that people were reticent and recognizing that families were also not allowing people into their home for their own fear of being exposed to COVID. So we had what, I hate to use the term, but the perfect storm for a family who wanted to hide themselves from public authorities.
Are you able to provide a status update on Michael? Is he still under state care, and does he have any long-lasting physical conditions or damage from the incident?
I will not speak and invade Michael's confidentiality. We at the Office of the Child Advocate are monitoring all three. Michael, I will tell you, has been reunited with Noah. He is doing well. And we will continue to monitor all three of the boys until they achieve appropriate permanency. And I will say we will probably be monitoring them through the early months when they achieve permanency. They are back in the custody of the Department of Children and Family and were on the day that the police arrived and took the boys to the hospital.
Maria, those three changes that you highlighted that you said are going to be taken into effect, the quality insurance of DCF looping back around, the education department making sure there's attendance, can you go into a little bit more detail as to how those were missed the first time around and what's being changed, what's being fixed about it?
I think that, as you all know, in Massachusetts we have a tradition of local control over school systems. At the beginning of the pandemic, because of my concern as the child advocate about schools being closed and most children attending school remotely, I was concerned that we needed to have a uniform policy to be issued to school systems around how to figure out whether a student was participating or not. Because my concern is that if children are not showing up for school, that can mean some good things, that they all took off for Maine and are in a cabin and are having a good time, or it can mean that the family has gone underground, which may or may not mean that there are Child Protective Service concerns. And so I think that it is, for me, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education issued guidance in what would be construed to be the traditional manner. They issued guidance to the local public schools, acknowledging that with 351 cities and towns and over 400 different school districts, that each one needs to figure out the best way of doing this. I think my strong sense is that we need a uniform standard across the Commonwealth for how attendance is taken and the response needed by public schools when a child fails to show up to school. And we cannot have a situation in which the accident of geography dictates whether an appropriate response is taken by a public school. And so I am urging that we adopt the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, be given the authority, if they don't already have it, to issue statewide attendance standards that go beyond the current standards of how many hours of instruction that you need to have, and really dictate how many days pass, what a school needs to do, how they contact the parents, and what happens if they get no response from contacting the parents. And that might include sending a truant officer. It might include asking the police to do a well child visit. It could include the filing of an abuse and neglect complaint with the Office of the Child Advocate, with the Department of Children and Families. And it can also include the filing of a child requiring assistance with the juvenile courts.
The administration has, for years, changed policies and made changes to address sort of systemic issues within DCF. What does this case and these failures say about those efforts by the state and administration to turn around the agency, which has been happening for years?
What I can tell you is that since I've become the child advocate for the Commonwealth, we have monitored the progress at the Department of Children and Families. And I think that the investment made, both by the administration and clearly by the House and Senate, in restoring needed resources to the department has allowed a certain level of rebuilding of the department. They certainly have staff that they didn't have in 2015 when I got here. There has been a massive update of policies and procedures, an increase in training availability. But the work of continuous improvement of DCF is never going to end. And I think that's what our recommendation around continuous quality improvement, which is that you need to constantly be looking at what your caseload is saying to you, what your outcomes are, whether those outcomes are what you want or don't want, and that there is a continuous need for improving policies and practice. So that's not going to go away. It's not a one and done when you are involved in child welfare. It is a commitment to a continuous learning process. That means that you are constantly examining what you're doing and that you have multiple systems that are looking to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. I think it's also very important to say that there is nothing, there's no way that I could say that if we implement every recommendation that the Office of the Child Advocate made in that report, that there will never be another child death. And I think that is the difficult reality of working in child protective services. That even with the most competent, experienced workers, you cannot be in every single person's home every single day, 24/7. And I want to remind people that 80% of the children who are being supervised by the Department of Children and Families, which is probably around 38,000 children, are being supervised while they're at home. And of the remaining 20% of the children, 55% of them are in a kinship foster placement, which means they're also at home with family. And we do not, in our constitutional scheme, put video cameras in people's houses so that the decision-making that is made to decide to return a child at home, to keep a child at home under DCF supervision, to remove a child with court authorization are judgment calls. And those judgment calls need to be informed with the best information possible, with the best evaluation tools possible, and in a group decision-making process. Because in the case of child welfare, 3 heads are always better than 1.
Also, the change that you had said about the juvenile court better looking into reunification.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That great deference is provided by juvenile court judges to the expertise of DCF workers. Clearly, they are the people who monitor the cases. They are the people who have the most intimate knowledge of what's going on with the family. However, we believe that both the juvenile court judges and the attorneys who represent the families, and that's separate attorneys who represent children and separate attorneys who represent the parents in these cases, that everyone needs to be aggressive at questioning the DCF decisions. There needs to be some real advocacy here around saying, explain to me why you think the decision that you're making to the judge is the right decision. We also believe that there is a challenge. Currently, the children who represent, the attorneys who represent children, that they are supposed to share with the court what the children want. And it has been my experience that even in the most abusive situations, children want to be returned to their parents. In the most horrific situations, that family bond is really strong, which is part of the reason why We try to place children in kinship foster care settings. But that strong bond and what the attorneys need to do in terms of presenting that to the court might not necessarily represent what's in the best interest of those individual children. And so we have also made a recommendation that the juvenile court, as part of its current massive project called Pathways to improve the practice in the juvenile court, consider adopting a practice where guardian ad litems could also be appointed, not just at the beginning of the case, but at other critical pieces of time in the case. And in my mind, reunification is a critical time to do an independent evaluation from DCF about whether those children will be safely returned to the home.
You also mentioned that you can't have cameras in all of the houses, right? But at the same time, when we're talking about doing virtual learning, one of the recommendations was that maybe the camera is turned on in the home so that you can actually see what's going on. So can you kind of talk about the difference in those two
Right.
recommendations, if you will?
Sure. What we want is appropriate monitoring of families. That there needs to be an appropriate risk assessment of the strengths, because each family, even families that are potentially have more weaknesses than strengths, each family has their own strengths and their weaknesses. And so what you want is an assessment by the capable people, trained people at DCF, so that those strengths and weaknesses can be assessed, and therefore an appropriate level of monitoring, depending on that risk assessment, be put in place. And that could be weekly monitoring, it could be monthly monitoring, in certain cases it could be daily monitoring. And those are things that are options. Obviously, it would cause a huge, or it could cause some increase in the cost needed by DCF in order to maintain enough workers that would be able to manage that uptick in monitoring. But there needs to be a connection between the clinical formulation of the case. What was it that caused children to come to the attention of the Department of Children and Families, and to make sure that there is a causal connection between that risk assessment and the department's response. And we also included a recommendation that the department be able to share some level of information with the public schools, so that the public schools, who clearly have the children there for many hours every day, that without violating the family's need for confidentiality, that the public school be alerted to the kinds of things that DCF wants to draw their attention to. So, for example, in this case, one of the reasons why the boys were originally removed from their home was the lack of school attendance. So that should have been a red flag that was communicated, because that was a sign in the prior removal that things had gone unstable in the household.
Do you feel as though these changes, recommendations are extremely time sensitive? We're obviously still in a pandemic, and I'm sure you fear that similar situations could be unfolding in the state.
I think what the pandemic has shown us, that in some respects we were not prepared for anything other than a limited weather emergency. So we kind of understood what would happen if we had a really bad snowstorm, even if we had a repeat of the blizzard of '78, where for a maximum of 2 weeks you would not be able, as a worker, to go out and visit the home. So you would require people to make phone calls, but that quickly thereafter, all of the visits that were missed would be able to be rescheduled. I think given what we're seeing in terms of climate change and some of the other things, that we need to be prepared ahead of time of identifying families that we believe are high risk, in this case, that decision about who was a high-risk family came after the pandemic, right? And I think that we need to be prepared for the next pandemic. One of the things that I will share with you is that in those early weeks after the governor declared an emergency, the Office of the Child Advocate worked to identify other children who were at risk because of the pandemic. And I think what we uncovered was that we had not thought about, at this level of depth, having lists of children with complex medical needs, right? We developed that list, and we developed that list pretty quickly. But there was not press the button and print out every child with a complex medical need in the Commonwealth, although we did assemble that really quickly and made arrangements. There were hundreds of children living in shelters, right? And those children were also at risk. So I think we need to do a serious debrief of what happened in the pandemic and be better prepared should there be another emergency by learning the lessons of what happened here.
Just to pick up on Amanda's point there, are you concerned there are more kids, more families that have fallen through the cracks that are expedited by the pandemic?
At the beginning of the pandemic, the Office of the Child Advocate, in conjunction with the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, conducted a major public relations outreach campaign, asking families to please, if they were having stress, if they needed food, whatever it was that they needed, that the Commonwealth was here to support them. And we worked together and enhanced the reactions of the 211 system and the Family Resource Centers. And in fact, the numbers from the Family Resource Center's most recent report indicates that they did step up and provide basic needs to thousands of families in the Commonwealth. I think that it is fair to say that historically, when we are in a situation of economic stress, that the level of substantiated cases of abuse and neglect goes up. That is unfortunate, that as families experience stress, that they take it out on their children. I am concerned that as schools reopen, which I am really happy that they are reopening, that as schools reopen, we will see an increase in the number of filings of abuse or an increase in the filings of neglect that will come to the attention of the Department of Children and Families. That is to be expected, and I know that the department has taken steps to be prepared to address those cases.
Just 2 quick points of clarification. You said that Michael and Noah are indeed still in DCF care?
Yes.
And also, yes, okay. And also, how was it that the boys were originally in New York and ended up here? Did the father move with them, or?
That is another question that the Office of the Child Advocate is exploring. We have reviewed certain court records from New York State, and I will admit that it is inexplicable that the New York Child Protective Service Agency returned custody to a father who had multiple times abused those boys and was found to be unable to take care of them. That custody was returned to John Alman without a request for Massachusetts to evaluate his fitness is a violation of the Interstate Compact. And we have, now that our investigation is complete, we have reached out to the New York State authorities to raise the issue of how those 3 boys were released from New York with no review of the current fitness of John Alman.
Maria, what recommendations require law changes, legislative changes?
I think it depends on the level of detail that the legislature chooses to mandate in statute. A great many of our recommendations are recommendations that involve changes in policy and practice. Some of those changes can be set in law. Certainly an example is the legislature could mandate that DESE issue statewide attendance standards, and that would be pretty consistent. There could be a mandate for the Department of Children and Families to provide the legislature with information about how they're going to implement all of these recommended changes, including an enhanced quality assurance system. So we will be in discussions with both the House and the Senate leadership. We have already been talking to them about our recommendations, and I expect that we will have the continued full cooperation of the Governor, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Education, and members of the legislative leadership in terms of sitting down and implementing quickly the recommendations coming from this report.
Going back to that school point, you mentioned that you fear reports picking up when schools return in person, but some schools did return in person this past year. Did you guys see numbers go up this past school year?
No, the number of, so there was a precipitous drop across the country and a drop in Massachusetts around the number of allegations of abuse and neglect that are basically, the bulk of our allegations come from teachers, and then the second biggest categories are from first responders, including medical personnel. There was a significant drop in the number of 51As coming from teachers, and that drop has continued. So it's gone back up, but not at the prior levels. And it inched up slowly, beginning in the late summer, but we are not seeing the return to the levels that were the pre-COVID levels. There is one thing I want to mention, and I think it's very important, and it relates to the work of the Office of the Child Advocate. Part of our commitment to ensuring fairness of access also needs to take into account that the children who are identified in allegations of abuse and neglect tend to be poorer children. And that what we know is because poor children are represented in families of color and in immigrant communities, that there is an overrepresentation of those children in terms of the numbers that are presented to the Department of Children and Families. One of the other mandates that the Office of the Child Advocate has is we currently chair what's known as the Mandatory Reporter Commission, and we have been charged by the legislature to review the Commonwealth's mandatory reporting laws. This is the first comprehensive review of the law since the law was originally passed in 1973 or 4. I can't even remember now. And we are taking a hard look to ensure that appropriate reporting happens and that people, because they are poor, are not subject to unnecessary reporting. But I say that at the same time as I focus on my role, which is to make sure that we have a system in place that protects children. And that I recognize that in child protective services, there is an inherent tension between protecting children and working with their families to ensure that their families have the capacity to properly raise them. This is a tension that has probably been there since Hull House in Chicago, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union here on Boylston Street, or the Grant Street in New York City, which is where I grew up. It is a tension that is never going to go away. But in this period where we are focusing on a renewed commitment to racial justice and equity, I want to make sure that we properly report things that need to be reported, but that no one files a 51A without being conscious of the implicit bias that each one of us has, having grown up in this society. So I thank you. I hope that the changes that we recommend, that we have evaluated, will be able to be operationalized across the Commonwealth, and that we will not have the horrific circumstances that led to David's death and Michael's near death in Fall River. Thank you very much.